Imagine craving something sweet, but the end of the month is closer than the next paycheck. No fancy ingredients, no time for elaborate baking, just whatever's left in the cupboard, and the hope you can turn it into something that still feels a little special. In the 1970s, that wasn't unusual, it was normal. Not necessarily because people were poor, but because being careful with money was simply part of everyday life, and those years came with real uncertainty. Prices were rising, but things didn't feel like they were improving. The oil crisis in 1973 hit hard. Gas got expensive almost overnight. Groceries followed, and suddenly, even something as small as dessert became a decision. Economists later called it stagflation, but at the time, people just felt it in their daily lives. And in that kind of situation, desserts weren't about showing off or experimenting. They were about making something, anything, feel a bit nicer at the end of the day. That led to some surprisingly clever ideas, some strange ones, and a few that honestly feel a little confusing today. In this list, we'll get to number 8, a dessert you don't even have to bake. Number 3, something called a salad that somehow still counts as dessert. And at number 1, something that looks more like a science experiment than food. Let's start at number 12. Number 12, ice cream float. It doesn't get much simpler than this. A scoop of ice cream with cheap soda poured over it. It almost feels too basic to count as a dessert, but that's exactly why it worked. The idea itself goes back to the late 19th century, yet in the 1970s it made perfect sense. You took two inexpensive things, combined them, and suddenly it felt like a treat. No effort, no planning, just a small moment that made an ordinary day feel a bit different. And that idea, making something out of almost nothing, shows up again and again on this list. Number 11, banana pudding. This one never really disappeared, but back then it looked very different from what you'd see today. Instead of carefully layered glasses, it usually came together in one big bowl, with pudding, bananas, and cheap cookies layered over and over until it was full. The goal wasn't presentation, it was making enough for everyone. Banana pudding had long been a staple in the American South, especially at church events and family gatherings where food needed to stretch. And that's really the key here. It stretched, which becomes even more obvious with the next one. Number 10, rice pudding. You didn't need much for this, just rice, milk, sugar, and that was already enough. It's one of the oldest desserts out there, but in the 1970s, its appeal was practical, cheap, filling, and reliable. Today, it might feel plain, maybe even forgettable, but back then, that wasn't the point. It was dessert, and that alone made it worthwhile. And if that still sounds like effort, the next one removes even more of it. Number 9, no-bake cookies. These skip the oven entirely. You heat a few ingredients on the stove, oats, cocoa, sugar, sometimes peanut butter, then drop the mixture onto a tray and let it set. That's really all there is to it. They weren't particularly pretty or refined, but they worked every time. And in a decade where life was getting busier, that kind of reliability started to matter more than presentation, which leads into something that quietly changed how people thought about cooking. Number 8, instant chocolate pudding. This is where things shift, because now you're not really making dessert from scratch anymore. You're assembling it. Powder, milk, a bit of stirring, and it's done. Instant pudding had been introduced earlier, but by the 1970s, it was everywhere, fitting perfectly into a changing society. More women were entering the workforce, time felt tighter, and convenience started to feel less like a shortcut and more like a necessity. Dessert didn't disappear. It adapted, and sometimes that meant removing the oven completely. Number 7, lemon icebox pie. This one is almost effortless. Condensed milk, lemon juice, and a pre-made crust mixed together, chilled, and served. It's closely related to key lime pie, just even simpler, and in the middle of a hot summer, that simplicity mattered more than you might expect. Cool, quick, and low effort. But if that already feels efficient, the next one almost feels like cheating. Number 6, dump cake. The name isn't subtle. You don't mix ingredients or prepare anything carefully. You simply layer them. Canned fruit goes into a dish, dry cake mix on top, butter over that, and into the oven it goes. And somehow it works. It might sound lazy today, but that wasn't the mindset at the time. Recipes like this spread through community cookbooks, practical collections people actually used, because the goal wasn't perfection, it was simply having dessert on the table. And sometimes that was enough. Number 5, pineapple upside down cake. This is one of those desserts that looks more expensive than it really is. Glossy, bright, almost festive, like something reserved for special occasions, yet underneath it's surprisingly simple. Canned pineapple, a basic batter, and a few cherries on top. That contrast is the whole point. The cake had already been popular decades earlier, but in the 1970s it returned for a reason. It made something inexpensive feel impressive, and that balance between appearance and reality keeps showing up throughout this list. Number 4, strawberry shortcake. Today, this dessert can look elegant, but back then, it was stripped down to the basics. A biscuit, some strawberries, and whipped topping. That was really all there was to it. No decoration, no extra steps. And somehow, that simplicity made it feel more honest. You can start to see a pattern here. The simpler things became, the more people appreciated them for what they were. But this is where the list starts to take a slightly stranger turn. Number 3, ambrosia salad. Calling this a salad already feels questionable, and it only gets stranger from there. Fruit, marshmallows, coconut, sometimes whipped cream, and in some versions, even mayonnaise, all mixed together in one bowl. No baking, no cooking, just combining everything and serving it. Ambrosia started as a more refined fruit dish in the 19th century, but by the 1970s it had changed completely. Canned ingredients replaced fresh ones, and sweetness replaced subtlety. And yet, it was everywhere. At family gatherings, potlucks, church events, and somehow, nobody really questioned it. Number 2, bread pudding. This wasn't created to be indulgent, it was created to avoid waste. Stale bread, too hard to eat on its own, was soaked in milk, mixed with sugar and eggs, and baked into something new. Simple, practical, and very old. But in the 1970s, that mindset wasn't outdated. It was necessary. You used what you had, you didn't throw things away, and if you could turn leftovers into something sweet, even better. Number 1, Jello Salad. Bright colors, smooth surfaces, and something about it that feels slightly unsettling. This is probably the dessert that defines the era more than anything else. Gelatin mixed from powder, poured into molds, filled with fruit, and sometimes with ingredients that don't feel like dessert at all, like vegetables, cream, or even mayonnaise. It holds its shape perfectly, it moves when you touch it, and it looks almost engineered. And for a long time, that was exactly the appeal. Because processed food wasn't seen as artificial back then. It was modern, clean, and efficient. Even though that mindset had already started to fade by the 1970s, the habit stayed. These dishes didn't disappear. They remained in cookbooks, at family tables, and in school cafeterias. And what makes this one so interesting isn't just how it tastes, but what it represents. A moment when people genuinely believed that something made from powder carefully shaped into something perfect could feel more impressive than something natural. And for a while, it actually did.